think I made my mistake when I tried to tell you about Skipper. That's where I made my
Maggie.
Big Mama, what you said about having children, it's still kind of a secret, but... Huh?
Oh, shoot, Maggie. Stop playing so dumb.
Well, no one would take that back once they got rid of it. You can send them all back.
She was the legendary violet-eyed star of Hollywood, the idol of millions of men around the world. Hollywood once believed she was just a beautiful face born to stand under the lights. Filmmakers saw her as a living piece of jewelry that could generate profit. But then the cameras rolled. The entire world fell silent, watching her ignite. Hollywood had no choice but to admit this woman is royalty of the silver screen. Her name was Elizabeth Taylor. But behind the glamour, there were dark shadows hidden beneath. Elizabeth Taylor was famous, but controversy always followed her. A screen queen thrown into 8 turbulent marriages, turned into a money-making machine by her own mother. Addicted to drugs, lost in alcohol, even rejected by her own children. This video will reveal the life and the darker sides of the legendary star Elizabeth Taylor. Don't miss a single moment, because her story will leave you stunned. A child who never truly had a childhood. Elizabeth Taylor was born into luxury, but it was not the kind of gentle luxury a child should have. She was born on February 27, 1932 in London, into an American family with wealth, taste, and social status. Her father, Francis Taylor, was an art dealer. Her mother, Sarah Southern, had been a stage actress. From the outside, everything looked like a perfect painting, a cultured home, well-connected parents, a comfortable life. But that very comfort created a kind of pressure that would trap Elizabeth Taylor's life in 2 words: tragedy. Elizabeth's mother did not just encourage her daughter to act, she practically orchestrated the entire career with the precision of a general planning a military campaign. Every audition, every smile, every carefully styled dark curl was calculated. At just 2 years old, her mother forced her to learn singing and dancing. Then the family moved to Beverly Hills in 1939. From that point on, her mother poured all her energy into her beautiful daughter, determined to turn her into a true star. Even Elizabeth's father did not dare approach his daughter without his wife's permission. At 10, Elizabeth signed with MGM and began a life that would never truly belong to her again. The studio system of the 1940s was a machine that swallowed children and spit out stars. Elizabeth spent her days on film sets instead of playgrounds, memorizing lines instead of learning math. Her mother pushed her to practice constantly, even when she was sick or exhausted. She stood between takes, giving notes, demanding perfection. The on-set tutor even dragged her to lessons by the ear, as if she were still a child to be controlled by hand. And through all of this, Elizabeth's education suffered badly. She struggled to read properly and had to count on her fingers to do basic math. In 1944, at just 12 years old, Elizabeth fell from a horse while filming National Velvet. The fall injured her back, and at first it seemed like a minor accident the doctors handled and moved on from. But what no one knew at the time was that her spine had cracked. The small fracture went undetected for years, quietly worsening over time. That injury would haunt her for the remaining 67 years of her life, through countless surgeries and constant pain. It was the first bill her body had to pay for what people called fame. From child star to MGM property, Elizabeth Taylor's career exploded after the turning point called National Velvet. The film was a massive success, and that 12-year-old girl almost overnight became one of MGM's most valuable assets. Columnist Hedda Hopper, a friend of her mother, once declared that at 15, Elizabeth was the most beautiful woman in the world. MGM did not disagree. In fact, they built her entire future on that belief. After National Velvet, MGM paid Elizabeth Taylor $750 a week, equivalent to about $13,000 to $14,000 a week today. for a girl just past 12 in the mid-1940s that was no longer a child actor's paycheck. That was the price of an asset Hollywood knew would generate enormous money. But MGM did not just support Elizabeth, they packaged her. They understood perfectly that Face could sell tickets, create frenzy, and keep audiences glued to the screen. So the studio began shaping Elizabeth into the embodiment of the perfect young woman in the American dream, pure glamorous, and always out of reach. And very early on, Elizabeth realized a chilling truth in the eyes of that system. She was not a girl growing up. She was an asset being evaluated day by day. As she matured, Elizabeth began to show her first signs of resistance against her mother's suffocating strictness. At 16, she confessed to her parents that she was exhausted from acting, tired of the endless cycle, and just wanted to grow up like other girls her age. But to her mother, that plea sounded like ingratitude. But the most brutal moment was still ahead. In 1949, billionaire Howard Hughes proposed that Elizabeth, then 16, become his girlfriend. Hughes was around 40 at the time and already had a long list of famous partners, including Lana Turner, Ava Gardner, Joan Crawford, Bette Davis, and Katharine Hepburn. When he met Elizabeth's parents, he even offered that if she agreed to marry him, he would spare no expense to build an entire studio just for the violet-eyed beauty. Sarah was shocked but thrilled by the lucrative proposal. But Elizabeth firmly refused. "No way, I don't need anything from him and I don't care about his money," she told her mother. It was the first time she dared to defy her. 2 years later, at 18, Elizabeth continued to defy her mother repeatedly. But this time, it was no longer just resistance. She began searching for what she had been missing her entire life, real love, and more importantly, the right to live her own life. The marriage spiral, 10 proposals, 8 marriages. Elizabeth Taylor received 10 marriage proposals in her life, but she only entered 8 marriages. Her first husband, Conrad Nicky Hilton Jr., came into her life when she was just 18. It was a decision driven not only by love, but also by rebellion. For the first time in her life, Elizabeth dared to go against her mother and choose her own path. Nicky was 23, the son of one of the wealthiest hotel magnates in Los Angeles. To Elizabeth, it felt like an escape. She believed she was in love. She believed this was real love. And more importantly, she believed this marriage would help her break away from the mother who had controlled her entire childhood. Sarah Taylor warned her. She said her daughter was too young. She said this might just be another infatuation like the ones Elizabeth had acted out on screen. But Elizabeth did not listen. The wedding unfolded like a dream, lavish, glamorous, pure Hollywood. But that dream lasted only until the honeymoon. The trip to France in May 1950 quickly turned into a nightmare. Years later, Elizabeth recalled it. With a voice still trembling from memory, she could not believe what she had gone through, as if she had been pulled from heaven and thrown straight to the ground. The man she had just married revealed a completely different side: alcohol, violence, and uncontrollable rage. At its worst, he beat her so badly that she miscarried. After just 7 months, the marriage collapsed. In February 1951, they divorced. Elizabeth walked away without asking for a single cent. "I don't need a reward for my failure," she said. At the time, Elizabeth was earning about £1,600 a week. At the same time, Elizabeth Taylor began working on a new film called Father's Little Dividend. She lost a significant amount of weight, became addicted to cigarettes, and frequently suffered from high blood pressure and stomach pain. At 19, she had to switch to eating baby food. Her second husband, Michael Wilding, appeared as a refuge. If Nicky was the first fall, Michael was the sense of safety Elizabeth had never known. They met while filming in London. Elizabeth was 20, and Michael was already 40. He was elegant, calm, mature, almost everything she needed after a deeply painful marriage. Elizabeth once said it plainly, he was more like a father than a lover, And perhaps that was exactly what she was searching for. Someone old enough to protect her, calm enough not to hurt her again. They married and had 2 sons together. For a while, everything seemed stable. But that stability did not last. Elizabeth was not someone who could live forever in stillness. After her early traumas, she became volatile, hard to control, and at times she herself triggered the explosions within the marriage. There were moments when they looked happy walking into a restaurant, but minutes later, everything could fall apart. Elizabeth could lose her temper, even strike her husband like a defensive reflex buried deep in her instincts. The marriage lasted 4 years and ended in 1956. Later, she admitted Michael was one of the best men she had ever known, but she was not mature enough to keep him. Once again, she did not find what she needed. Her third husband, Mike Todd, was the first man who could truly handle Elizabeth's temper. He was not just older, but strong, humorous, and extremely decisive. A successful producer, a man who knew how to control every situation. Elizabeth married him just 1 year after leaving Michael. To her, Mike was not a refuge. He was a new wind. He took her to lavish parties, introduced her to the world in a way that was both playful and proud. More importantly, he treated her like a child who needed to be loved gently and with patience, something Elizabeth had never received growing up. During this marriage, they barely argued the way she had before. And if they did, Mike always knew how to calm things down. A gift, a surprise gesture, and everything would settle again. Elizabeth loved him in a softer way, with fewer storms. When their daughter Liza was born, she believed she had finally found what she had been searching for. But fate once again was not on her side. In March 1958, Mike Todd died in a plane crash. Everything collapsed overnight. People said that at the funeral, Elizabeth wanted to throw herself into the coffin. The pain was unlike anything she had ever experienced. This time, she did not lose a marriage. She lost the only love that made her believe in peace. And then, in the middle of that grief, the fourth husband appeared. Eddie Fisher, Mike Todd's close friend. A man who already had a family, already had a wife, Debbie Reynolds, and had once been a friend of Elizabeth. But loneliness and loss pull people together in ways that are hard to resist. Eddie left his wife to be with Elizabeth. The public did not forgive. They called her a homewrecker. They condemned her, criticized her, turned their backs. But Elizabeth kept moving forward. She married Eddie in 1959 at 27 as a way to avoid facing the enormous emptiness inside her. But very quickly she realized it was a mistake. This marriage was not built on love, but on the fear of being alone, and that fear could not sustain a relationship. The most important thing to understand is that Elizabeth did not marry many times out of impulsiveness. She married because each time she entered a relationship, she believed the next person could save her from loneliness, save her from old wounds, and perhaps save her from herself. But among all the men who passed through Elizabeth Taylor's life, only one did not simply become a husband, but became an addiction, a destiny, and the deepest scar of her life, Richard Burton. Richard Burton, the most fated, scandalous, and haunting love of the century. If Elizabeth Taylor's first 4 marriages were attempts to find shelter, Richard Burton was something entirely different. He did not come to heal. He came to stir everything up. The first time Burton appeared in front of Elizabeth on the set of Cleopatra, he walked up to her and flirted, "Has anyone ever told you that you're beautiful?" To Elizabeth, nearly 30, and the most famous star in the world, it sounded ordinary. Burton's reputation came before him, a Welsh actor with a mesmerizing voice and a habit of charming his female co-stars. But everything changed on January 22nd, 1962, when they filmed their first scene together. There was no lightning strike, only a powerful pull. Elizabeth no longer saw Burton as an arrogant womanizer. She saw a man who was intelligent, intense, dangerous, and irresistibly real. The problem was that both of them were already married. Elizabeth was still the wife of Eddie Fisher. Burton was married to Sybil, who had given him 2 daughters. Fisher gradually stopped wanting to visit the set because the way Richard and Elizabeth looked at each other had become too obvious. Sybil believed it was just another affair, but this time was different. Burton was not just cheating, he was falling into an obsession. Their private story quickly became a global sensation. Burton called it Le Scandal, and he was not exaggerating. Photos of them kissing on a yacht in the Mediterranean, photos of them walking along Via Veneto in Rome covered the front pages. The obsession was so intense that John Glenn's orbit around the Earth in 1962 was pushed off the front page. The Vatican even spoke out. Elizabeth was condemned for being involved with Burton while still married to Eddie Fisher. The public was outraged, the press went wild. But Elizabeth and Richard barely stepped back. They knew the world was watching them like an explosion, yet they kept moving forward. Eventually, they both divorced. On March 15, 1964, they married in Montreal. Elizabeth was 32, Richard was 38. He became her 5th husband. She became his 2nd wife. From then on, they acted together, earned millions together. But what made them legendary was not just money, beauty, or fame. It was intensity. They loved like a storm, lived like fire meeting gasoline. And then the inevitable came. Elizabeth's medications, Burton's alcohol, the tempers and endless arguments slowly eroded the marriage. They divorced in 1974 after 10 years together. But even as they let go, Elizabeth still called Burton and asked, "Do you think we just made a terrible mistake?" They remarried only to separate again less than a year later. Because Richard Burton was never just a husband to Elizabeth Taylor. He was the greatest addiction of her life, the destiny she could not resist, and the scar that never healed. And when the Burton storm passed, what remained was not just a broken heart, but a body that had begun to rebel, a mind exhausted, and a woman who would increasingly rely on medication just to keep herself from collapsing. A body in revolt and the battle with addiction. There is a very painful paradox in Elizabeth Taylor's life. While the public still saw her as a screen goddess, her body had already begun quietly rebelling long before. The horseback fall during National Velvet was not just a childhood accident. It opened the door to decades of pain, turning her back, hip, spine, and even her ability to move into real battlefields. Elizabeth did not just live in glamour. She lived in chronic pain, in repeated surgeries, in the feeling that her body was no longer obeying her more and more. And then, like so many people forced to live with long-term pain, she gradually slipped into painkillers, sleeping pills, and alcohol. What made Elizabeth's story different from many other stars was that she did not hide completely in the dark. She shocked people by openly admitting she was addicted, then voluntarily entered rehab at the Betty Ford Clinic. At that time, for a Hollywood beauty icon to speak plainly about struggling with medication was something almost no one dared to do. It made her image both more fragile and stronger. She was no longer a perfect symbol. She became a famous woman, publicly fighting the wreckage inside herself. But the truth is that the years that followed were not any easier. From the 1990s on, Elizabeth's body clearly declined. Heart disease, chronic pain, pneumonia, repeated hospitalizations, long surgeries, and worsening health. She had to endure a body marked everywhere by medication, scalpels, and illness. Later on, she often had to use a wheelchair. The woman who once walked like the light of Hollywood was now trapped inside a body that was weary, heavy, and full of limits. That is why the phrase tortured soul in this story does not refer only to a tormented spirit. It showed itself in her body in every difficult step, every pain that would not stop, every moment. Her body betrayed the glamour the whole world had once adored. The bitter part is that while Elizabeth Taylor's body kept wearing down, the name Elizabeth Taylor never lost value. On the contrary, it became a vast, luxurious, almost royal money-making empire. the price of living like royalty. When people think of Elizabeth Taylor, they think immediately of diamonds. They remember the dazzling jewelry, the legendary gifts from her romances, the stones tied to each chapter of her life. Elizabeth did not just wear jewelry. She turned it into part of the legend called Elizabeth Taylor, making the luxury around her no longer just a spending habit, but its own language, overwhelming and mesmerizing at the same time. But what matters even more lies behind that layer of light. By the end of her life, Elizabeth Taylor's wealth was often estimated in the range of hundreds of millions of dollars, with some sources pushing it close to $1 billion. Even though the exact number has always been debated, there is one very solid fact to hold on to: the auction of her jewelry collection at Christie's in 2011 with the legendary jewel sale, alone bringing in $115,932,000, setting a historic record. That alone is enough to show how enormous the Elizabeth Taylor name was in the luxury market. But Elizabeth did not live on film salaries alone. She also built a fragrance empire, most notably White Diamonds, the perfume line that kept her name printing money even after her movie star peak had long passed. In the end, the thing that made Elizabeth Taylor lastingly rich was not Hollywood, but her ability to turn the legend of Elizabeth Taylor itself into a profitable brand. But if money, diamonds, and fame had truly been enough to save her, Elizabeth Taylor would not have had to search for meaning somewhere else, in a place where for the first time in her life, she was no longer fighting only for herself. Her greatest legacy, from the mid-1980s on Elizabeth Taylor's life, entered a chapter not many people ever thought would come. The woman the whole world had seen as a symbol of scandal, romance, and luxury began to become one of the strongest humanitarian voices in Hollywood. That turning point came after Rock Hudson's death in 1985. At a time when HIV/AIDS was still covered in fear and misunderstanding, many celebrities chose silence. They were afraid it would damage their image, afraid of losing their audience, afraid of being pulled into a crisis. America still did not want to face directly. Elizabeth went the other way. She did not stand outside it. She walked straight into the place others still avoided. She became the founding national chairman of AMF-AR and later established the Elizabeth Taylor AIDS Foundation. What makes this journey memorable is not just the amount of money she raised, but the timing of when she chose to speak. This was not a moment when doing charity work was a safe choice. This was a time when speaking up about HIV/AIDS meant accepting the risk of being misunderstood, labeled, and dragged into controversies that stars at the time wanted to avoid. Elizabeth used the very thing that had put her under scrutiny her entire life to fight for something larger. She used fame. She used her magnetism. She used her ability to make the media look her way. There was only one difference. This time, she was not doing it for movies, for men, or for diamonds. She was doing it for people dying in the dark, abandoned by family, judged by society, pushed to the margins by illness. At this point, Elizabeth Taylor changed the meaning of fame. She turned the spotlight that had once scorched her life into something that illuminated the places the public had deliberately looked away from. There is a beautiful paradox in that final chapter. The woman once consumed by the press as scandal became a moral figure with rare weight in Hollywood, not because she suddenly became perfect, and not because her noisy past disappeared. On the contrary, it was precisely because Elizabeth understood what it meant to be judged to be seen like merchandise that when she spoke up for others, her voice carried real weight. It was not clean in a saintly way. It was real in the way only someone who had lived through collapse could be. And then, when the romances had faded, when her body no longer had the strength to keep fighting, what stayed beside Elizabeth Taylor in the end was not the noise of scandal, but a legacy that even death could not dim. Queen Elizabeth Taylor died at 79. On March 23, 2011, Elizabeth Taylor died in Los Angeles of congestive heart failure at the age of 79. That news closed the life of a woman the whole world had followed. She died after years of failing health, with a body marked by pain medication and one surgery after another. But it was also in that moment that people saw more clearly than ever the almost unrepeatable arc of Elizabeth Taylor. She began as a child star swallowed too early by Hollywood, grew into the beauty queen of the silver screen, lived through 8 marriages, became a symbol of diamonds, love scandal, and finally ended her life as one of America's great humanitarian voices. What made Elizabeth Taylor special was not simply that she was beautiful. What made her different was that she lived as if everything in her life had been pushed to the extreme. As a little girl, she was already so famous that the entire MGM system saw her as an asset that could print money. As she grew up, she became a sensation. The press followed her because Elizabeth Taylor herself had become a vast drama of beauty, desire, power collapse, and survival. That was the kind of glamour classic Hollywood was very good at creating, but very few carried the way she did. The public remembers Elizabeth through many different images. Some remember the violet-eyed girl in National Velvet. Some remember Cleopatra, the film that made her the center of a cultural earthquake. Others hear her name and instantly think of Richard Burton, of legendary diamonds of marriages crashing one after another like waves. But if you look more closely, what made her endure was not a single moment. Elizabeth Taylor was not the kind of legend locked forever inside one role. She is remembered for an entire life force, a way of being present, a way of loving, hurting, spending money, resisting, and surviving that no one could copy. That is why her film legacy also carries real weight. Elizabeth Taylor won 2 competitive Oscars for Butterfield 8 and Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, 2 milestones strong enough to prove she was not just a beautiful face the camera happened to love. In Butterfield 8, she showed her ability to bring pain onto the screen. In Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, she was fierce, venomous, stripped bare, and no longer hiding behind beauty at all. Then, the Jean Hirschholt Humanitarian Award sealed a different truth. In the end, Elizabeth Taylor was remembered not only as a movie star, but as a woman who used all of her fame to do something bigger than herself. That is what made her death in 2011 leave such a deep echo. When Elizabeth died, Hollywood did not just lose a star. Hollywood lost a kind of star that had already gone extinct. The kind of star the public did not consume with reason, but with obsession. The kind of woman who made audiences admire her, pity her, judge her, and still never look away. She always contained enough contradiction to keep the world talking for years. She could be a beauty icon, then the very next day become the center of scandal. She could be the goddess of diamonds, then become a patient in a wheelchair fighting pain. She could be a woman dismissed as scandalous, then become one of Hollywood's strongest humanitarian faces. Maybe that is why, even today, the question of Elizabeth Taylor has never really been closed. In your eyes, what is she remembered for most? For beauty that stunned the world, for 8 marriages, for her fated love with Richard Burton, or for the humanitarian legacy she left behind after so many turbulent years? Some people spend their whole lives being called tragic, fallen, scandalous. But when they are gone, the shadow they leave behind is still too large for Hollywood ever to replace.
This content is for informational and entertainment purposes only. Thoughtfully compiled from public archives, historical records, and classic articles. While we strive for accuracy and balanced storytelling, some details from Hollywood's golden age remain unconfirmed and should be treated as speculative. We encourage viewers to draw their own independent conclusions. If this journey through Hollywood's shadows resonated with you, please leave a gentle like and subscribe with the bell icon so you never miss our next chapter. To continue uncovering the forgotten tragedies of the Golden Age, simply select the video on your screen right now. Thank you for keeping their memories alive.